Most men spend their entire lives trying to understand women, without ever realizing that the answers were never hidden in words. They were hidden in patterns, in silence, in emotional reactions, in the things women rarely say directly but reveal unconsciously through behavior. And the tragedy is that most men notice these truths only after heartbreak, confusion, or years of emotional exhaustion. The Stoics understood something dangerous about human nature long ago. People rarely reveal themselves through what they claim. They reveal themselves through what consistently affects them emotionally. And once a man learns to observe instead of react, he begins seeing truths most people remain blind to forever. There was a man named Lucian. Quiet, disciplined, thoughtful beyond his years. Unlike most men around him, Lucian stopped chasing shallow validation early in life. He became fascinated instead by human behavior, emotional patterns, and the invisible forces controlling relationships beneath the surface. He noticed something strange. The more desperately men tried to impress women, the more invisible they became. But the men who carried calmness, direction, and emotional control seemed to affect people without effort. At first, he thought it was confidence. Later, he realized it was something deeper. Self-possession. The ability to remain emotionally grounded without seeking constant validation from the outside world. And this realization became the first secret most men never understand. Women are deeply affected by how a man makes them feel emotionally, not merely by what he says. Words can impress temporarily. Energy reveals truth. Lucian saw this repeatedly. Men spoke endlessly, trying to convince women of their worth. But the men who moved calmly, listened carefully, and remained emotionally stable created something far more powerful. Presence. And presence cannot be faked for long. One evening, Lucian sat with an older philosopher in a quiet cafe hidden beneath the noise of the city. The old man observed people silently for a long time before finally speaking. Most men lose women before they ever truly understand them. Lucian asked why. The old man smiled faintly. Because men listen to words. Wise men observe emotional patterns. That sentence stayed with him for years. Because once a man begins observing patterns, the illusions disappear quickly. He notices that many women do not test men consciously. They test emotional stability unconsciously. Not through dramatic challenges. Through subtle moments. Silence. Distance. Disagreement. Emotional uncertainty. And these moments reveal who a man truly is beneath performance. Weak men become reactive. Insecure men become controlling. Emotionally dependent men become desperate. But grounded men remain calm enough to think clearly. That calmness affects women more deeply than most men realize. Not because women enjoy coldness, but because emotional steadiness creates safety. And safety is deeply attractive in a chaotic world. This became the second secret Lucian discovered. Women rarely say they crave emotional stability directly, but they instinctively move toward men who possess it. The modern world confuses attraction with excitement constantly. But excitement fades quickly when instability enters the connection. Peace lasts longer. The Stoics believed that a man unable to govern himself becomes governed by circumstances, emotions, and other people. Lucian watched this happen everywhere. Men abandoning principles for attention. Men sacrificing dignity to avoid loneliness. Men reacting emotionally to every small shift in female behavior. And each reaction quietly weakened them. Because emotional control is not suppression. It is mastery. One night, Lucian met a woman unlike anyone he had encountered before. Intelligent. Composed. Difficult to read emotionally. Most men around her performed endlessly for her attention. Lucian did not. Not out of strategy. Out of inner calm. And strangely, that unsettled her more than attention ever could. Because the third secret most men never learn is this. Women become curious about men who are emotionally fulfilled without needing constant external validation. Neediness repels. Wholeness attracts. The more Lucian observed relationships, the more he understood another hidden truth. Women often communicate emotionally before they communicate verbally. Their silence speaks. Their energy shifts. Their warmth changes. Their attention moves. And men who are disconnected from emotional awareness miss these signs completely until the relationship collapses. This became the fourth secret. A woman's behavior usually reveals her emotional state long before her words do. But most men are too reactive to observe clearly. Instead of watching calmly, they panic, overanalyze, chase reassurance, force conversations prematurely, and in doing so, they destroy their own clarity. Lucian learned that emotional patience creates insight. The ability to remain calm during uncertainty reveals truths panic never will. Weeks later, the woman asked him something unexpected while they walked slowly through crowded evening streets. "Why do you never seem desperate for attention?" Lucian thought carefully before answering. "Because peace became more important to me than validation." She remained silent after hearing that. Not because she lacked a response. Because truth often silences people before it changes them. And in that moment, Lucian understood the fifth secret. Women deeply respect men who do not abandon themselves emotionally to gain approval. Self-respect radiates quietly. Most men think attraction comes from appearance, money, or perfect words alone. But women who have experienced life deeply begin noticing something more important. Emotional discipline. The ability to remain calm under pressure. The ability to lead oneself before trying to lead anyone else. The ability to hear emotion without becoming controlled by it. These things create trust subconsciously. And trust shapes attraction far more deeply than temporary excitement ever will. One evening, Lucian observed a couple arguing intensely at a nearby table. The man reacted emotionally to every sentence. Defensive. Loud. Desperate to prove himself right. The woman slowly emotionally detached while he continued speaking. And suddenly Lucian saw the sixth secret clearly. Women lose emotional attraction when a man loses control of himself repeatedly. Not because men should suppress emotion, but because uncontrolled emotion creates instability. And instability eventually exhausts intimacy. The Stoics warned that emotional impulsiveness clouds judgment and weakens character. Lucian understood now why that mattered so much in relationships. A man's emotional state affects the atmosphere around him constantly. Calmness lowers tension. Desperation increases it. Neediness suffocates it. Discipline stabilizes it. And women feel these shifts immediately, even when they cannot explain them logically. Over time, Lucian discovered another hidden truth few men ever understand fully. Women are often attracted to how a man lives, not just how he speaks. His habits. His focus. His mission. His self-control. His relationship with adversity. This became the seventh secret. A man with purpose becomes naturally magnetic because his life does not revolve entirely around female attention. Purpose creates gravity. Without purpose, men become emotionally dependent too easily. And dependency eventually creates pressure inside relationships. One rainy evening, the woman looked at Lucian quietly and asked, "What is it that makes some men unforgettable?" Lucian looked toward the rain touching softly against the windows before answering. "The way they make people feel in their presence. Not performance. Not perfection. Presence. The ability to create emotional calm instead of emotional confusion." And that led him to another realization. Most women are emotionally exhausted by modern relationships. The games. The inconsistency. The emotional unpredictability disguised as romance. So when they encounter a man whose words align with his actions consistently, it affects them deeply. That became the eighth secret. Consistency creates emotional safety, and emotional safety creates attachment. Not manipulation. Not psychological tricks. Consistency. The rarest trait in modern dating. And finally, after years of observing human nature, Lucian understood the ninth secret most men spend their lives misunderstanding completely. Women do not truly want perfection. They want emotional truth. A man secure enough to be honest. Disciplined enough to remain grounded. Strong enough to stay calm. Self-aware enough not to project his unresolved chaos onto everyone around him. And once a man understands these truths deeply, he begins seeing relationships less as emotional games to win, and more as mirrors revealing the level of peace two people carry within themselves. And that realization changes everything a man once thought he understood about love. Because suddenly, attraction is no longer a mystery to be solved through tricks or performance. It becomes a reflection of internal order. Lucian began to notice this shift not only in others, but within himself as well. The way he spoke became more intentional. The way he listened became deeper. The way he reacted became slower, more measured, almost effortless. And people around him noticed too. Not because he was trying to be different, but because he was no longer leaking emotional instability into every interaction. The woman he had been observing also began changing subtly. Not in the way she behaved outwardly at first, but in the way she responded internally. She no longer felt the need to test him constantly. No longer felt the urge to provoke emotional reactions just to measure his stability. No longer felt uncertain about where she stood in his life. Because uncertainty disappears where consistency exists. One evening, she said something quietly while they sat near the river under dim streetlights. "You make things feel simple." Lucian looked at the water for a moment before replying. "They are simple. People just make them complicated when they are emotionally unstable." She smiled faintly at that, but there was something deeper in her expression now. A recognition. Because deep down, she understood what he meant. Most emotional chaos does not come from relationships themselves. It comes from internal conflict projected outward. And Lucian had no internal conflict spilling into her world. That alone separated him from most men she had known. But something else was happening beneath the surface. She was beginning to trust him in a way she had not experienced before. Not blind trust. Not emotional dependency. But something more grounded. The feeling that she did not need to protect herself from unpredictability. And for someone who had lived through emotional inconsistency before, that feeling was powerful enough to slowly reshape her understanding of connection. The Stoics believed that trust is not built through promises, but through repeated evidence of character over time. Lucian embodied that principle without ever needing to explain it. Days turned into weeks, and the dynamic between them deepened not through intensity, but through absence of chaos. There were no emotional games, no sudden withdrawals, no manipulative silence, no dramatic highs and lows, only steady presence. And that steadiness began doing something unusual. It softened her defenses. Not all at once, but layer by layer. She began sharing thoughts she usually kept hidden, fears she rarely admitted, memories she had never spoken aloud. Not because she felt pressured, but because she no longer felt unsafe doing so. Lucian never interrupted her vulnerability with advice. He simply listened, and that alone created something rare. A space where she could exist without being corrected, judged, or emotionally managed. One night, as rain tapped gently against the window again, she asked him something different. "Do you ever get tired of being this calm all the time?" Lucian thought for a moment, then answered honestly, "It's not calmness that takes effort. It's avoiding unnecessary emotional reactions." She looked at him quietly after that, because she was starting to understand something important. His stability was not a personality trait. It was discipline. And discipline, unlike emotion, does not fluctuate. That realization quietly shifted how she perceived him. Not as someone emotionally distant, but as someone emotionally controlled. And control, when not used for manipulation, becomes a form of safety. The ninth secret was no longer just something Lucian understood intellectually. Because when a man masters himself internally, he no longer needs to chase, prove, or perform externally. He simply exists in alignment. And that alignment changes how others experience him without effort. One evening, she looked at him longer than usual. Not with confusion anymore, but with clarity. And then she said something softly, almost like a conclusion forming inside her mind. "I think I finally understand what you've been doing all this time." Lucian met her gaze calmly. Not questioning. Not defensive. Just present. And in that stillness between them, something unspoken settled naturally. Because when emotional truth is finally understood, there is nothing left to argue with. Only awareness. And awareness always leads to change, whether a person is ready for it or not. And change, once it begins inside a person, does not announce itself loudly. It moves quietly, like a door closing in one life and opening in another. She felt it first in her thoughts. The questions that used to dominate her mind began to lose their urgency. Where is this going? What does he really feel? What if I'm wrong again? Those questions still appeared sometimes, but they no longer controlled her emotional state. Because for the first time, she was not interpreting connection through fear. She was observing it through clarity. And clarity is what Stoicism always points back to. Lucian noticed the shift too. Not because she said anything different, but because her presence around him changed. There was less tension in her silence, less testing in her words, less emotional unpredictability in her reactions. She was no longer trying to decode him constantly, because she no longer felt she needed to protect herself from instability that wasn't there. One evening, while they sat outside under a calm sky, she finally asked something she had been avoiding for a long time. Why does it feel like I can breathe properly when I'm with you? Lucian didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't know, but because he understood the weight of what she was really asking. She wasn't asking about him. She was asking about herself. About the version of her that only existed when she felt emotionally safe. After a moment, he spoke quietly. Because you're not preparing for emotional damage anymore. The words landed softly, but deeply, because she realized how true it was. Most of her past experiences in relationships had been shaped by anticipation. Anticipation of disappointment. Anticipation of inconsistency. Anticipation of emotional withdrawal after closeness. Her nervous system had learned to stay alert even during moments of peace. Because peace had never been stable before. But now, something different was happening. Her body was learning a new reference point. Calm without conditions. Presence without unpredictability. Connection without emotional pressure. And that kind of experience does something subtle but irreversible. It rewires expectation. The Stoics believed that suffering often comes not from reality itself, but from the interpretation shaped by past wounds. Lucian saw this unfolding in her slowly. She was no longer reacting from old emotional patterns. She was beginning to respond from present reality. And that difference changes everything in human connection. One night, she said something unexpectedly honest while resting beside him in quiet reflection. I used to think love always had to feel intense to be real. Lucian remained silent, allowing her to continue. But now, she paused, intensity feels different. It doesn't feel like love anymore. It feels like confusion when there's no stability behind it. That was the moment something shifted permanently inside her understanding. Because she was no longer romanticizing emotional chaos. She was recognizing it. And recognition is where detachment begins naturally. Not through force, but through awareness. Lucian had never tried to convince her of anything. He had only remained consistent enough for her to see the difference on her own. And that is the deepest form of influence a man can have. Not persuasion, but embodiment. Weeks passed again, and the connection between them continued deepening, but in a quieter way than either of them had experienced before. There were no emotional spikes, no dramatic conflicts, no unstable cycles of closeness and distance. Instead, there was continuity. And continuity creates trust at a level that intensity never reaches. She began noticing something else too. She was calmer even when he was not around. Her mind no longer spiraled into assumptions or emotional projections. Because her nervous system was no longer conditioned by unpredictability. It had been stabilized through experience. One afternoon, she asked him something while walking slowly through a quiet path lined with trees. Do you think people can really change who they are in relationships? Lucian thought for a moment before answering. Yes, but only if the relationship exposes who they already are clearly enough. She nodded slowly, absorbing the meaning. Because she understood what he meant. Relationships do not create character. They reveal it. And sometimes, they refine it. The ninth secret was no longer just something she was learning about men. It was something she was beginning to understand about herself too. That what she had once called love had often been emotional survival in disguise. And what she was experiencing now was something entirely different. Not escape from emotion, but freedom from emotional instability. And that realization does not stay theoretical for long. It changes what a person is willing to return to. Forever. And once a person sees clearly, returning to illusion becomes almost impossible. Not because temptation disappears, but because awareness changes what temptation feels like. Lucian noticed it in her behavior over time. Situations that would have once pulled her into emotional confusion now passed without disturbance. Words that might have triggered overthinking before now simply passed through her without attachment. She was no longer absorbing everything emotionally. She was observing it. He was living it now. And observation creates distance. Not emotional coldness, but clarity. One evening, as they sat quietly after a long day, she finally said something that had been forming inside her for a while. I think I understand now why my past relationships felt so exhausting. Lucian looked at her calmly, waiting. I wasn't actually in love, she continued. I was constantly trying to stabilize something that was never stable to begin with. Silence followed. Not heavy silence, but reflective silence. Because realization often needs space before it settles fully. Lucian spoke softly after a moment. Most people confuse emotional effort with love. But real connection doesn't require constant emotional repair. Those words stayed with her longer than she expected. Because they dismantled something she had believed for years. That love must be difficult to be meaningful. That struggle equals depth. That emotional intensity equals truth. But now she was seeing something different. True depth does not feel chaotic. It feels grounded. And grounded things do not constantly shake the nervous system. They stabilize it. That night, she found herself thinking about her past differently. Not with anger. Not with regret. But with understanding. Because for the first time, she could see that many of her emotional experiences were not love stories. They were patterns of unresolved insecurity interacting with emotional unpredictability. And that realization softened something inside her. Not her feelings, but her attachment to confusion. Lucian, meanwhile, remained unchanged on the surface. But internally, he understood something important. He had not changed her. He had simply stopped adding chaos to her emotional world. And when chaos is removed, truth naturally becomes visible. That is something most men never realize. You do not need to convince someone of emotional safety. You need to consistently embody it long enough for their nervous system to recognize it. One afternoon, while they walked through a quiet street, she suddenly stopped and looked at him. Not with confusion anymore, but with certainty forming in her expression. You never try to control anything emotionally, she said. Lucian replied calmly. Because control is what people use when they don't trust stability. She nodded slowly. Because she was beginning to understand the difference now. Control creates tension. Trust creates space. And space allows connection to exist without pressure. As days continued passing, something deeper began forming inside her awareness. She no longer associated emotional unpredictability with passion. She associated it with exhaustion. And that shift alone separated her old emotional identity from her new one. The Stoics believed that transformation is not a sudden event, but a gradual alignment between perception and truth. And that alignment was happening quietly within her now. One evening, she spoke softly while watching the sunset fade. I don't think I could ever go back to how I used to feel in relationships. Lucian didn't respond immediately. because he understood that some statements are not questions. They are realizations being confirmed internally. Finally, he said, "You won't. Not because you choose not to, but because your nervous system already knows the difference now." She remained silent, but something inside her confirmed it. Deeply, permanently. And in that silence, the final understanding settled naturally. The thing she had once searched for in intensity had always existed in something much quieter. Consistency, presence, emotional discipline, and peace that does not require chaos to prove itself. And once that truth is seen clearly, everything else begins to feel like noise. And noise, once recognized as noise, loses its power to pull a person back into confusion. Lucian saw this transformation not as a dramatic shift, but as a quiet unraveling of old emotional conditioning. She was no longer reacting to life as she once did. She was interpreting it differently. A delayed message no longer triggered anxiety. A moment of silence no longer felt like abandonment. A slight emotional distance no longer created panic. Instead, there was patience. And patience is what appears when fear begins to dissolve. One evening, she asked him something softly while they sat under dim light. If peace feels this good, why do so many people avoid it without realizing? Lucian thought for a moment before answering. Because peace removes distraction. And most people are not ready to face themselves without distraction. She stayed quiet after hearing that. Because something in her recognized it immediately. Distraction had once been her comfort. Overthinking. Emotional highs and lows. Constant interpretation of other people's behavior. It all kept her mind occupied. But it also kept her from seeing herself clearly. Now, in this quieter state, she was beginning to notice things she had previously avoided. Her own emotional triggers. Her patterns of attachment. Her tendency to confuse uncertainty with depth. And although this awareness was uncomfortable at times, it was also freeing. Because awareness is the beginning of emotional independence. Lucian remained consistent throughout all of it. Not adjusting himself to match emotional fluctuations. Not becoming reactive when she was uncertain. Not withdrawing when things became emotionally complex. He stayed steady. And that steadiness became the reference point her nervous system began trusting. Over time, something subtle but powerful happened. She stopped seeking emotional reassurance as frequently. Not because she no longer cared, but because she no longer needed constant confirmation to feel secure. That shift marked a deeper change than either of them spoke about. Because dependency was slowly being replaced by stability. One afternoon, while walking through a quiet path surrounded by trees, she finally said something that carried years of reflection inside it. "I think I used to think love was supposed to feel like something you have to constantly hold on to, or it disappears." Lucian glanced at her briefly, then back ahead. "And now?" he asked. She took a slow breath. "Now it feels like something that stays even when you're not holding it tightly." Lucian nodded slightly. Because that was the moment she had crossed from emotional survival into emotional understanding. Not through explanation, but through experience. The Stoics believed that wisdom is not what you hear, but what you eventually stop arguing with internally. And she was reaching that point now, where her past beliefs no longer matched her present experience. One evening, as rain softly touched the windows again, she looked at him longer than usual. Not searching, not questioning, just observing. And then she said quietly, "It feels strange, how something so calm can feel so strong." Lucian didn't respond immediately, because he understood what she was realizing. Strength is often misunderstood. Most people associate strength with intensity, but real strength is stability under emotional pressure. The ability to remain unchanged when circumstances fluctuate. Finally, he spoke softly. "Strong things don't always feel loud. Sometimes they just don't break when everything else is unstable." That statement settled deeply into her, because she could now feel the truth of it through lived experience, not theory. Weeks passed again, and the connection between them no longer felt like something being built. It felt like something being revealed, layer by layer, without force, without fear, without confusion. She no longer questioned whether she was too much or not enough, because those questions only arise in unstable emotional environments. And she was no longer inside one. One night, as she rested beside him in complete silence, she realized something simple but irreversible. She was no longer trying to be chosen. She was simply experiencing what it meant to be with someone whose presence did not require her to abandon herself. And that realization closed something inside her quietly. Not an ending, but an awakening. Because once a woman understands the difference between emotional chaos and emotional peace, she never confuses them again in the same way. And from that point forward, even silence begins to speak a different language. And silence, once understood, is never empty again. It becomes information. Lucian noticed that she no longer filled every quiet moment with questions or emotional uncertainty. She could sit beside him without needing to analyze what was unsaid, without needing to create meaning where there was none. This was not detachment. It was maturity forming through experience. One evening, as they sat under dim light with rain quietly pressing against the windows, she spoke more slowly than usual. "I used to think I needed intensity to feel connected to someone," she said. Lucian listened without interrupting. "But now I think intensity was just my mind trying to feel something, because stability felt unfamiliar." That realization lingered in the air between them. Because it was no longer theory. It was self-awareness earned through contrast. Lucian replied calmly. "The mind often confuses emotional turbulence with depth. But turbulence is just instability in motion." She nodded slightly, absorbing the weight of it. And for the first time, she didn't resist the idea that some of her past love stories had been built on emotional uncertainty rather than genuine connection. Not because she regretted them, but because she could finally see them clearly. Clarity removes illusion, but it also removes confusion. And with confusion gone, decisions become simpler. Days passed quietly, and something subtle continued unfolding inside her. She stopped trying to interpret every action, stopped searching for hidden meanings in pauses, stopped overanalyzing tone changes, stopped predicting emotional outcomes before they happened. Instead, she began responding to what was real in front of her, not what fear projected. And that alone changed how she experienced everything. Lucian remained the same in his behavior. Consistent, present, unreactive to emotional fluctuations, steady in tone and intention. But what changed was her perception of him. She no longer saw his calmness as distance. She saw it as reliability. And reliability is something the nervous system learns to trust over time. One afternoon, while walking slowly through a quiet path lined with trees, she asked him something that carried deeper reflection. "If someone is calm all the time, how do you know they actually care?" Lucian thought for a moment before answering. "By consistency, not intensity." She looked at him as he continued. "Intensity changes with emotion. Consistency changes with character." That distinction stayed with her longer than anything else he had said, because it reframed everything she had once misunderstood. She had once equated emotional highs with love, but now she was beginning to understand something more grounded. Love is not what overwhelms you. It is what remains stable enough that you no longer feel the need to protect yourself from it. Weeks turned into something quieter. Not routine, but rhythm. A natural unfolding without pressure. And in that rhythm, she began to notice something inside herself that surprised her. She was no longer afraid of losing him in the same way she had feared losing others. Not because she cared less, but because she no longer related love with instability. Her fear had been replaced by trust. And trust does not demand constant reassurance. It simply observes reality as it is. One night, she rested her head lightly against his shoulder while they sat in silence. And after a long pause, she said softly, "I don't think I ever really understood what emotional safety felt like before this." Lucian didn't respond immediately. Because some realizations deserve space before they are shaped into words. Finally, he said quietly, "You didn't lack love before. You just experienced it in unstable environments." That sentence settled into her deeply, because it reframed her past without blame. Only understanding. And understanding is what allows a person to move forward without carrying emotional residue. As the night grew quieter, she remained still beside him. But internally, something had changed permanently. She was no longer interpreting connection through anxiety. She was experiencing it through calm awareness.